afternoon. Sorry to keep everybody waiting. Not my call. We don't need to wait for a quorum for a briefing, do we?
Sydney just stepped out, and Evan was here too.
He'll be here momentarily. Yes.
Don't believe we need a quorum for a briefing.
GO Chairwoman Navarro can't join us right now, so I think we're ready to get started. Ms. Hochberg, we're very glad to see you. Ms. Shaw, Mr. Edwards, please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, council members. I'm Adriana Hochberg. I'm one of the Assistant Chief Administrative Officers and the county's Climate Change Coordinator. Thank you for the opportunity to brief your committees on the stakeholder work group recommendations for the green building incentives for commercial and multifamily properties. I'm joined here today by Lindsay Shaw and Stan Edwards from the Department of Environmental Protection, and they played a key role in convening the stakeholder work group and in drafting the recommendations report that the executive shared with you in June. I would also like to take a moment to recognize the efforts of the work group members who volunteered their time and expertise to develop the recommendations in this report. And several of the work group members have joined us today and are available to offer their perspectives. This work was an in-depth effort to revise the county's approach of the green building property tax credit to align it more closely with the county's climate goals. The executive supports the work group's recommendation to restructure the commercial green building tax credit program to use energy efficiency as a primary factor to access tax credits. I'm going to be turning it over to Lindsay and Stan, who will go over the work group recommendations in more detail, and then I'll wrap it up by talking about how the green building incentives fit within the larger context of the county's climate planning effort, and we'll also discuss possible next steps.
Terrific. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So we'll start on slide 2.
Can you move your microphone closer?
Yes, I can. Thank you. So we wanted to give a brief overview of the current green building incentive before we dive into the recommendations of how to change this. But at a very high level, there's $5 million of a cap available on this property tax incentive program for commercial and multifamily properties. The amount and duration of the credit for each building depends on the characteristics of the building and the LEED rating level that's achieved. You need to achieve a LEED rating or an equivalent standard. The county property tax credit that you receive ranges from 10% to 75%, and you can either receive that credit for 3 or 5 years, depending on the rating that you receive and the building type that you are. We can show a matrix that helps visualize that a little bit, but it's a pretty well subscribed program. If you want to go to the next slide. It was pretty clear that changes were needed. With the adoption of the 2012 IGCC, there is a scenario in which a building uses an alternative compliance path to both meet code and earn an incentive. So in addition to that, that current program has been in place since 2008. So I think that in 11 years, revisions are needed. But additionally, there is a backlog, currently 2 to 3 years estimated, based on what's currently in the queue. And one thing to note is that not all buildings that are eligible for the LEED incentive submit applications for them. So if everyone that was eligible for the credit submitted applications, the backlog would be much larger. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of these slides just so we can get to questions. But I do want to make another call out for the stakeholders that were involved. If we can go back one slide. These are a number of the work group members who were involved in the process. They met over 8 months and met for 13 times in addition to work done outside of those meetings. So a lot of work went into this process, and I think the stakeholders really put, I think, their interests aside and put kind of the interest of the county and the interest of kind of the future of green building in Montgomery County into this report. And so I'm really grateful for their time, their efforts, and their expertise. So when we met back in July 2018, we went over these general work group goals, and the GO and T&E committee agreed that these were work group goals that they agreed with some of them being the need to revise the green building tax incentive because of this double dipping that could happen. Very unlikely, but is a scenario that can happen. Shifting from building certification to to the primary energy efficiency focus to align with the county's climate goals, to build in a regular review of the incentive structure so we don't end up here in 11 years from now, and then making sure that our incentive programs build on top of code, and so as building code improves, so does our incentive program. So we don't need to revisit it every time, so it's not static. Okay, cool. So briefly, just looking at the new construction incentive, again, in line with the council's climate emergency resolution, the stakeholders really focused on greenhouse gas emissions and energy reductions as the prime metric for obtaining a incentive from the county. There is a later bonus that you can get for getting third-party certifications that are beyond the LEED rating system. The stakeholders also had an interest in expanding the existing incentive dollars to more building owners to have a broader participation in the program. I'm going to skip this next slide too. So I want to get to the overall concept of the incentive program. This is what the stakeholders painstakingly worked for many months on. So this two-tiered incentive program, we believe, based on our research and what's going on in Maryland and the nation, that this is the first program that looks like this. So it's pretty innovative and groundbreaking. The incentive starts out with a measurable reduction in energy use, both in existing buildings and new construction. And the new construction incentive, you need to meet a minimum percentage energy performance of 10%. So anything 10% above code, which we have the IGCC in addition to the existing energy code, that is a challenging floor to meet. And then it ramps up over time with a curve that increases. As your building is more efficient, you actually get more of an incentive. And then once you get to the second tier, once you meet that first tier, then you're able to get an additional incentive for meeting Passive House, Living Building Challenge, BREEAM, and higher LEED standards. And then existing buildings can reapply a limited number of times if they continue to improve, but we're looking at continuous improvement. The stakeholders also looked at two other elements in the report that are worth noting. One is a structure to sunset the existing program that's on the books, since building owners have made construction decisions based on that incentive program being in place, to not pull the rug out from under them. We designed that to be around the building permit issue date. And then also how to evaluate whatever incentive program is adopted in the future to make sure that an incentive program is addressed at a regular interval, like the building codes on a 3-year cycle. So that's the basis of the report. I am going to turn it back to Adriana to talk about where we've come from since the report was finalized.
Great. So since the final recommendations report was delivered to council, we kicked off our climate planning process for the county. We have 5 technical work groups that are currently convening, working to develop recommendations related to buildings, clean energy, transportation, as well as adaptation, sequestration, and public engagement. Some of the key issues that are being considered related to buildings include a building energy performance standard for existing buildings, net zero building codes for new construction, and the 2018 International Green Construction Code that's currently being reviewed for adoption by DPS, Department of Permitting Services. To have a chance of meeting the county's greenhouse gas reduction goals, incentives alone are not going to be enough. As we move forward, we're going to need to explore a combination of requirements and incentives together. As more stringent requirements for new and existing buildings are put in place in the coming years, we foresee that tax credit incentives will have a need to be integrated with these other actions to ensure that they work in sync with each other. This means that the tax credit will potentially need to be revised over time, and as Lindsay just mentioned, we support that the periodic review of the tax credits every 3 years to ensure program effectiveness, and it does align well with the IGCC code adoption cycle. I'd also like to take a moment to address the issue of the annual cap for the program. The current tax credit program is capped at $5 million annually. The work group recommended that there should be no annual cap on incentives for new construction. Because tax credits translate into fewer county taxes collected to pay for needed services, the executive does not agree with this recommendation. As we look towards implementing more climate initiatives, we're going to need to look critically at what gets us the most bang for the buck. We need to invest resources wisely, given that there are important climate and other priorities that the county is trying to achieve, but no new significant county money to fund these new initiatives. One reason for not overinvesting county resources into tax credits is that it's not fully clear the extent to which they serve to incentivize buildings to achieve deeper greening. It's possible that for some buildings, tax credits are acting as rewards for building owners who would otherwise be doing it regardless. When making a recommendation, it's important to be informed by data. What are we getting in return for investing county resources? But unfortunately, there is no Montgomery County specific data or studies that have been done to shed light on the causal relationship between incentives and greener buildings. Because we were grappling with this issue of lack of good local data to inform decision-making, in his June transmittal letter, the executive had recommended a new lower annual cap be set at $3 million. However, we are open to keeping the updated program at the $5 million annual level for fiscal year 21, while we seek to gain a better understanding of the extent to which the updated tax credit is incentivizing projects that would otherwise not be coming into fruition. Moving on to slide 12, the next slide. Thanks. With regards to possible next steps, the incentive structure, because as Lindsay mentioned, appears to be the first of its kind in Maryland, it may require a ruling from the state, specifically from the Maryland Green Building Council, to make these changes. And we are currently working with OCA to determine whether, in fact, we need to go forth before the Maryland Green Building Council to obtain a decision from them. Assuming we do need to go to them for a decision, and assuming we receive a favorable ruling, we're ready to start drafting the legislation to implement the updates. Legislation would need to be developed both to sunset the existing tax credit as well as to establish the new incentive program. So this concludes our formal remarks, and we're ready to take any questions from the committees.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Keith, do you have any remarks you want to add at this time before we get to the council members' questions?
Just to note, the current legislation is very specific in terms of the property tax credit amounts, the eligibility requirements, the cap, and actually there's caps within the cap, depending on how you are certified in the current program. So the expectation is that any change to move forward with this new regime would require similar, very specific legislation. So issues like the sunsetting, the cap, and all those conditions would be specific in the legislation. So that's where the heavy lifting will have to be done. But it is helpful to hear today from the committee members any issues you may have or want explored in advance, perhaps, of legislation being introduced. Because that it would be the next step, would be introduction of legislation after we get confirmation that we don't need enabling state legislation.
Right. I'll hold a couple of mine, but just as a process question, Keith, were you participating at all in this work group, or were there any other council
I did not participate on the stakeholder work groups. We do have representatives from the stakeholder groups here that are would be happy to talk about the process and their thoughts.
Right. I mentioned this to the county executive, but I always do think it's helpful for our sort of preparation, expectation setting to, invite some council staff to participate as well, so that we can sort of keep up to speed with the developments of the committee. And I do want to say at the beginning, I'm really grateful to all the members of the work groups that are here and all the ones who couldn't join. And again, I'm very, very sorry to be starting this so late in the day and to have to reschedule from yesterday's unfortunate events. 13 meetings is a lot to ask of anybody, and especially nothing that you getting paid to do. So we're very, very grateful for all the time you put in. Okay, so first, Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. Okay. I wish we had another 20 minutes for the presentation that we got. You blazed through a lot of information there. And I may have missed the July meeting. So I'm going to need to just refresh here a little bit. But the work group has recommended that there should be a new eligibility for the tax benefit, and that this should have no cap. Is that right? And then there's a second tier that has that does have a cap, and I'd like you to just explain that a little bit more. And then, but a couple other questions I wanted to ask as well. What is the current waiting list? What is the uptake of the current program? You had said that exceeding the IGC, I think you had said by 10% would be quite an achievement. Can you speak more to that? Is it, I'd like you to speak more to that. Like, having no cap on the tax credit might be fine if it's truly like a stretch goal, but I did share the criticism of this program that there were buildings that seemed unlikely that they would have been LEED anyway, but then also that the uncertainty about whether you were going to get the credit would seem like it would mitigate against the effectiveness of the credit as an incentive, because if you don't know if you're going to get it, you're not going to build it in, and you're either going to have to do it or not do it. You're not going to do it based on an incentive that you don't even know if you can get. So can you talk a bit about the uptake of the existing, is there a waiting list? I know we've maxed out, but how many more buildings would have provided, would have been, are eligible than we are able to provide for? And then do you know what that might be under the work group's recommendation?
Okay. Hopefully I can answer all of your questions unless you want to take a stab first.
ahead.
Okay, great. So the work group did recommend having no cap on this program. The rationale behind that, which we wrote in the full, I think it's a 40-page report, talks about how if you are building a brand new building that is basically taking a zero tax revenue and adding eventual tax revenue into the stream for the county, so providing a discount on that for the first few years for a high-performance building might be minimal when you have tax revenue that you'll be getting out of that building for the next 40 or 50 years. So that was the very theoretical rationale of saying no cap. But the stakeholders did acknowledge that that might be unrealistic. So they did say that.
Well, okay, but my question is more to what you think how it would play out in the real world.
Sure. So, and I just want to address your questions about the current program. So there is an approximate 2 to 3 year wait list or backlog. People that apply for the current tax incentive will get their incentive. They're just going to get it later. So one example was a building that applied in 2017, finally got their credit in levy year 2019. I will say that in levy year 2019, there is a very large backlog of a very small number of buildings. They're very high-performing buildings that have achieved LEED Platinum in Montgomery County.
I mean, how can you be sure that buildings will get it? If the backlog keeps growing, at some point, you can't really say that buildings will get it if the backlog grows every year.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure that it grows every year. It does cycle. So folks that, the people that are on the backlog list right now submitted their application in the last year. But to pay that out will take 2 to 3 years.
You feel like there's some certainty?
And the legislation is an entitlement, so if they qualify for the credit, they are not removed from that list just because the cap room is not there. It could be a couple of years or even more, but they are eligible to receive it. It's a yes/no up front, not a maybe. It's just a matter of when.
So if they were, in order for them to lose it, it's subject to appropriation.
Well, no, it's subject to the cap room, which is foregone revenue. So it's not appropriated, but the Department of Finance does manage the program and keeps track of how many credits are approved.
If the council reduced the cap room, that would stretch it out quite a long time.
It could, We had a similar issue with the clean energy tax, residential tax credit some years ago, where we had an influx of solar panel installations that applied for the credit. Eventually, the council chose to end the program, but the folks that were already in it were left in and ultimately got the credit some years later.
So it's a reasonable expectation that if you do the building, you will get the credit. You're not totally sure when.
Right.
But, absent some fairly unusual action by the council, you're going to get it. It just
Now,
takes
of
a
course, on the commercial side, we were talking, there are issues of return on investment. That time frame may matter, certainly, but as Lindsay said, under the current law, they would still be eligible to get the credit. It wouldn't be a matter of whether they get it or not, it's when.
Okay, that's helpful.
I wanted to address your
please.
point about the 10% above code requirement, but I know you turned on your mic to
Sorry,
say something.
Sorry, while we're just on that topic, have you heard of any instances of the backlog affecting people's financing?
I haven't heard of that, but maybe the stakeholders in the room could speak to that.
You wouldn't? Good, great, okay.
Collective head shakes. Okay. So the 10% above code achievement, you'll see on the screen here, it might be a little challenging to read, but it's in your packet.
Circle 13 of your packet.
Thank you. This is the structure of the tax incentive program. So in order to come in to be eligible, you need to meet a 10% above code minimum. So that we did have a lot of discussions in the stakeholder work group about the differences between different sector plans. And so it says applicable code. So if you're in the downtown Bethesda sector plan area, you still need to meet 10% above that minimum.
That's a high-performance building
It's an extremely
district.
high-performance building. So in order to, so you have to be a high-performance building to build in Bethesda, but in order to get paid for it, to get the incentive, you need to build something that's extremely high-performing. So a 10% above code, the challenge with this process has been that it is a bit of an apples to oranges comparison. We had multiple stakeholders say, I can't take a case study of the existing LEED program and apply it to the new structure because I would have made different decisions if this structure was in place. I would have prioritized energy savings and not necessarily everything that the LEED scorecard has on it. So it's energy first, and then if you happen to get a building certification like the ones that are listed in the blue box below or the darker gray box in your packet, that would give you an additional bonus on top of what you've earned for the energy efficiency credit.
So why did you say that 10% better than the standard is, very difficult?
I mean, I'm not a building code expert, but getting anything above code is challenging. So the stakeholders felt that 10% was enough of a stretch, but it wasn't completely out of reach. So it's not, not everyone who goes through permitting services is going to be eligible for this credit. Some buildings might get 5%, some buildings might get 7%, but you need to strive to meet that 10% floor if this incentive program is driving you to build high-performance buildings in Montgomery County.
And this is a measure of the building's energy consumption and
It's
efficiency?
designed energy performance for new construction.
Which is what?
So they have to meet a certain code level, and this would be a percentage increase in efficiency above that code level design.
So is every net zero building automatically
A net zero building,
percent better than the green building code?
Yes.
By
net zero building would qualify for the maximum incentive.
would qualify.
That's 100%. Yeah. If you look at the table on Circle 13, that gives you a little, and there's a lot of details here, but I just want to emphasize one thing that the stakeholder work group was interested in again, encouraging buildings to not just do a little bit, to go to that next level. That's why the multiplier you see in the middle of the page there, to try to, if you can get to 20%, but you can do a little bit more and get to 21%, you get a bigger incentive. So it's trying to drive buildings to be as efficient as possible, and that's another feature of this. It's not a straight line incentive. It encourages increased performance.
I see. So if you go to 31 to 40%, you're eligible for a tax credit of 46 to 60%.
Yeah, between that, yep.
All right, I'll pass it along.
Sorry, do you want to join us on this point?
If that's okay, Chet Knopp, I'm with Spectrum Energy. So the previous program was based off of LEED certification. And so LEED certification for version 3, which is 2009, and V4, actually follow the ASHRAE guidelines 90.1 of 2010. However, the Maryland state minimum is actually at 2013, about ready to go to 2016. So just because your lead in the previous outline to meet the code minimum is greater than lead requires right now. And I think that's the point that we are trying to get across, or we're trying to get across in the work group, is you're already doing better than lead, so then to add 10% more is even harder to overcome. But you'll also take a look at the multipliers that we put in here. As you get to 21% and 31%, the incentive goes up based off of that, because it's so much more of a challenge to make those. And so the reward should be given there if you're trying to truly overcome and reduce energy consumption. Does that explain it?
Does quick. We just passed the 2016 Green Building Code. What did we adopt?
2012 IGCC.
I thought we were further along than that.
So it took a long time to get the 2012 IGCC put
Now
together.
we're going to, but we'll soon be taking up the
2018.
2018.
Yes.
And this would, your thinking was envisioned in relation to the 2018?
Yeah, that's why we have built into the new program where it cycles with the code cycles, so that it gets reviewed. So as code gets reviewed, then this gets reviewed, and maybe the percentages change. Who knows, right? But it kind of sets in this mandatory review right after the codes are approved to make sure that the program aligns well.
The percentages above code are always tied to the code that's in effect at that time. So if we adopt 2018, it's 10% above the 2018 IGCC and the energy code as well. In 21, we'd like to come back and review the program, but if we don't, this would still stay above the code that's adopted in 21. So always ensuring that the building that's being built at the time it's permitted is more efficient than code in order to get the incentive.
Do you have concerns about offering a credit for buildings that are 10% better than the 2012 code, even as we know the 2018 code is out there in adoption elsewhere?
The timeline we're working on, hopefully the 2018 code will be adopted prior to the adoption of this. We're further along on the code adoption than we are on the legislation that would make this change.
This might be hard to answer. How unified were the members of the work group on the recommendations?
That's a really good question. I will say that, if I could put it on a 1 to 10 scale, I'd say 8 out of 10. We did
10
have
being unified.
10
Perfect
being unified.
consensus.
Perfect consensus. I shared the drafts of this report and got comments back. I didn't get any direct comments back saying I don't agree with anything that's in here. We had free and open meetings for people to come and voice their opinion, but I did have a request from one stakeholder to add a line in there saying that being associated with this report does not confer agreement with everything in here.
Did you hear from community stakeholders, developers and others that aren't on the work group?
I have not, although there were community members involved in this process, so they were at the table with the developers having these conversations.
And to what extent, so I'm giving you questions that are hard to answer, but to what extent do you feel like we have recommendations that work for, that the recommendations you have work for all stakeholders? For example, I'm looking at Shane. We know the Duffy Group is doing great work, and they're building LEED Platinum hotels, and they're investing in passive house construction. To what degree do we need more incentives for them to do all those good things and more buildings, or to stretch farther in the buildings they're already putting up? Or to what degree do we need other recommendations to bring other developers that aren't so virtuous into this field?
I'm going to let Shane talk since he's made his way up.
Can I just say something, Shane, before you?
Dan, go ahead. Sure.
I just would say, one of the things the stakeholder work group was interested in is making sure the incentive was accessible to more developers. And this structure, I think, is certainly more accessible than the LEED structure, which has a lot of requirements built in and costs built in. And this is the feeling of the work group, the approach we've taken here with energy improvements being the first tier of getting the improvement, did make it more accessible to more developers. And
It's fair to say that's always been more of a challenge, right? Is getting more developers that aren't so informed and interested in this to participate more than just getting Shane to go even farther.
That's certainly
Is
part
that
of the
right?
challenge, yes.
And I think that the existing building program, which we haven't talked too much about, gets into that more. It uses a platform that building owners that already need to comply with the benchmarking law are using anyway. So it's easier for them to access the incentive program. Previously, for existing building owners to improve their buildings, they needed to meet the LEED existing buildings operations and maintenance requirement, which is not accessible for all buildings. So this allows buildings that are striving to meet Energy Star, it allows them to participate in the program as well.
Right. There's more here for existing building owners, a lot more, right? Shane, sorry.
Sure. For the record, my name is Shane Poland, Director of Development of the Duffy Companies. Thank you, everybody, first of all. Thank you for your kind words. Also, thank you to the staff. We did meet a lot of times on this, and some of what everybody said, I think, is true. Touching on a few of them, how does it affect financing? You almost can't count on it, as Councilmember Reamer mentioned, because there's an uncertainty as to when it comes. And so you can't really, time is money, and it's a return on investment, and that's our concern with the reduction in the value that goes to the program. How a project like ours worked, I can speak to our family business, but we looked at what our new LEED Platinum hotel was if we had just built it as the quality, durable building we were going to build. It scored in the low LEED Gold range. We looked at the incentive, and we said, what's the value of that incentive, and can we strive more? We looked at the value, and then we turned to our team and said, how can we turn this building into platinum? And so it was material to have this. I am the champion within our company, but I work with my uncle, I work with my cousin, and most businesses work with others who are not so driven by the sustainability side. The goal here was reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and that's why the focus became energy. And so that's why the entire first part of this, and again, we are focusing on the new buildings, but we spend also an equal amount of time on the existing buildings, because there's some really low-hanging fruit and some real incentive that we need to create in those areas. I look at this with a little bit of pride. We actually drafted this multiplier concept at a meeting all together where we're trying to really push all buildings, and I don't think the idea that it's sort of a reward for buildings that are already doing this is an interesting concept. To take those who are trying to do the right thing and to try to strive to build the best buildings we can, and that they qualify therefore available incentives, and for them they weren't incentivized, they were rewarded. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, which is I think what I heard in the opening remarks. I mean, we do think this is the right way to do it. We would like to go as far as we can, but there are always financial constraints. As you mentioned, we're working on Passive House, and it would push these limits, but affording companies like ours the ability to push the limits set, we think, examples. I'll just give you a brief example. We like American Ninja Warrior in my house. This is an obstacle course program. My 10-year-old daughter is a big fan. And what you'll find on American Ninja Warrior is often there's a very difficult obstacle. You'll see almost all athletes fail to achieve the obstacle, and then suddenly somebody will achieve the obstacle. And what you find after that happens is that suddenly everybody seems to be able to achieve the obstacle. This way, why is this? I think it's for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is oftentimes people saw how it was done. Oh, you got to throw your leg over, you got to jump, you time it this way. So there's a technical aspect to it. And the other is a mental aspect. Say, oh, if they can do it, if Tom did it, then, shouldn't Hans be able to do it? That type of thing. And that's, we look at that as somebody sees a new LEED Platinum hotel, someone's going to see new, we have zero net energy buildings that we're putting out, and it provides that type of example. I think that you can see that already in our history with LEED, right? Many projects were kicking and screaming. Most developers, don't really readily adopt new systems. But LEED came, the county took a leadership role, created the high performance incentive we have, and now those buildings are pretty ubiquitous. So we think this is just the next evolution, and it's meant to grow with the standards.
Thank you. Okay, Councilmember Katz. You got it? Okay.
Thank you for that. Just quickly, first of all, I appreciate the work that has been done. Thank you for convening this. And, we've been focused like really into the weeds here on specifics, and I think that's important and reflective of the incredible and deliberative work that the work group did. And but taking it, kind of back up to the policy level, and what I think the kind of next steps of this discussion, at least from my perspective, we have a work group that did great work, that brought in stakeholders from various different interest areas and backgrounds, had 80% perfect consensus or whatever that would be quantified as was discussed earlier. It was done, the work was done at the behest of this body to do it, and came up with a set of recommendations. I have real concerns about paralysis by analysis, and with all due respect to the county executive, and I totally appreciate where you're coming from, but we're either serious about this or we're not. And as we heard earlier, I mean, if our greatest risk here is we're rewarding the folks who are doing the right things and making it profitable to significantly reduce your greenhouse gas emissions in buildings, which are some of our largest producers of greenhouse gas emissions, and help bring us significantly closer to our goals, where do we sign up? Game on. So, my view is, particularly on the new construction, my understanding of where the work group came on that front was that we're recapturing more in the value of the building. And so, we are recapturing that money. I mean, what's lost here is that there's a value to the county in the construction as well, and property tax receipts, et cetera. And so it's not just about, this idea that we're giving money and there's nothing being gained in terms of a public good for the money that we're giving is the wrong way to look at it. This is an investment and a commitment into what we have all up here and in the executive office, have said is one of our top priorities. And I don't think we can wait. I think that we've waited long enough, that there's a very significant and deliberative process that took place here. And I would hope and would love to see some direction from us to have staff draft something and for us to move forward and to get this deployed and to actually move the needle on a priority area. I mean, we could sit here and talk about this forever, and we can analyze it till these are outdated and we have to come up with a new program, and then we can start analyzing that, and before we know it, we'll have done literally nothing to address what we've stated is our chief, or one of our chief goals here. So I don't agree with the county executive's recommendation of what I think is watering down the entire purpose of this effort, and I think would diminish the consensus that was built from the work group. I think the department deserves a tremendous amount of credit for its work here. I think all of the members of the work group deserve credit for coming together. I think that we have a very thoughtful approach, and let's deploy it. Let's put it to work. Let's see what happens. If it needs to be tweaked, then fine, but we will never come to a situation where we find a perfect policy, and if we try to, or if we wait for perfection in order to do it, we will have missed the boat entirely, and frankly, we'll all be underwater. So let's move forward. Let's do it. Let's, I think, go forward with what the work group has suggested at the request of this body, and let's do it. And I think, there might be some state legislative issues that need to be worked out. Fine, let's work that out. I don't think, if we have to wait until lawyers discuss with each other what isn't allowed, I don't think that we will be moving quickly enough. So let's get an answer. Let's focus on it, and let's review a bill and put this into work if that's the rest of the consensus of colleagues.
Council member, if I could respond, the executive does agree that while more analysis needs to be done, we do not want analysis to stand in the way of action. We would like to move forward with the program even while we're learning more about it, and we are open to keeping it at the $5 million level.
Agree to agree, then.
Okay, back to Councilmember Katz. It wasn't. Okay, Councilmember Glass.
Thank you. A lot of really good questions. I agree that this is all about the data and about the deep analysis, and so thank you to everybody, all the stakeholders who spent your time trying to figure this out, and this, the math that is behind me, kudos to you, right? But these are the types of things that we need to figure out, how to support the projects that we want. I think the American Ninja Warrior is a very apt parallel. You might hear me use that in other instances from now on. I will give credit where it's due. But diving back to the granular level, one of the questions I have is regarding the differences between the new and the old building and the incentives. Can the stakeholders explain to me what the thinking was between structuring it for 4 years across the existing buildings, and then just the 2 years for older buildings, or did I invert that? Yes, thank you.
That's correct. Well, so with the existing buildings, we were thinking that after they do upgrades to improve their score, that they might want to do future upgrades. So then they're able to use that again, the program again, whereas with the new buildings, you're building a new building once. And we actually reduced that, like you said, to 4 years. The previous or the current program has a 5-year. And so the point was to reduce it a year so that we could spread the wealth to get more people kind of into the program. At least that's my interpretation. Sorry, it was a big work group, yeah. And I really enjoyed all the all the discussions that we had there, and personally for me and my business. About a year and a half ago, I had a client that came to me, and I've just found out about this program, and they were going to go lead silver with $150,000 or $150 million building in Bethesda, a multifamily, and we told them, well, hey, Montgomery County has this program, plus we can get you these utility incentives. Do you want to change from silver to gold? And it made sense. They were completed with their plans for their building, and they changed their design to improve efficiency to get eligible for this program, which brings into one other thing that we did, which was this sunsetting and the way that you apply for this program, which I think will take a lot of people that are more reserved and, as Shane talked about, concerned about the financing side. Right now you can't depend on it because you put your application in after you get your LEED certification. Once your building is completely done, probably 6 months to a year after it's done, the way that we changed the program was to put the application in during permitting, which is a much earlier phase. So then at that point, now you're able to have, to understand that those monies are available. And, sorry to continue on.
I appreciate your sharing your perspective. I don't know if anyone has any other. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm Jonathan Bauer, Sustainability Manager with the Tower Companies. To your question about the existing buildings, I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think one is, and before I say anything else, thank you for your leadership, obviously, on this issue, and DEP for leading this effort. We were honored to be a part of that. But back to the existing building issue, I think we realized 4 years it needed more investment because we all know the greenhouse gas issue is not new buildings, it's our existing buildings. And so we wanted to put a renewed focus on that and get more building owners to the table, and 4 years of incentives for them was, when we convened, seemed adequate. And I'll also add to that, we also thought through, well, what if you have a building that improves and then improves again and again and again and just keeps reapplying? So we decided to put in a cap there so they can't keep reapplying over time, right? Your building can get better a few times and then, right, they've kind of capped out on the incentive. But I think the bottom line is that the majority of the dollars need to go to existing buildings and need to go to building owners who don't have a voice either, right? And a lot of those are existing building owners or small building owners. And I think we all came together, obviously Shane and I from the perspective of we're, larger developers that have been doing this for a while, but we said, how do we get smaller building owners or others who are not in this circle involved? And if we can show them that piece of paper, which that's on the new construction, but if you flip it to the existing, if you can show them that and explain it and have service providers like Chet and others kind of go out and do that work, you'll get them to the table because it makes sense and it's pretty easy to understand, and it's, maybe not easy to achieve, but there's, research and effort behind this now to show that, there's financial incentive to do this, and so to wake up, right?
Well, and I think that's a great goal, and it leads to another issue, wanting to provide these supports so that more people come to the table, as you said, but the reality is since 2008, so for 10 years, 2008 to 2018, there have been 62 applications, the packet says, and that's approximately 6 a year. And so bringing people to the table is a laudable goal, but how much room is there at the table to support their projects? And so taking a step back, looking at this over the last decade, is a program that facilitates the improvement of 6 buildings, rather than me adding the statement at the end, how efficient is a program? How helpful is a program that only does 6? And I open that up to anybody, quite frankly.
I think that's a fair point, and that's kind of back to, I think Lindsay mentioned it before, is it's apples to oranges when you compare the old program to the new program just because of the way the structure is and the way that it works. And so this newer program, and just thinking about existing buildings more, is they're going to get less dollars and an incentive to do these projects to improve their buildings than the original buildings in the old program did. And so maybe not in all cases, but in many of the cases where you have very poor performing buildings coming into the program, they're receiving less dollars, so you can actually get more buildings into the program that way. The way it's structured is totally different the way that this is outlined. So I get your point. Very few buildings, and you look at all the buildings in the county, maybe we're in the beginning of this program, but that's part of why we changed this.
Well, and then let me ask Ms. Hochberg, from the executive branch, what is the efficiency of this efficiency program if we're really only doing 6 projects a year?
To the extent that the program can incentivize buildings that would otherwise not be greening their buildings to that level, that is a plus. But as I stated earlier, I think that to really move the needle on reaching our greenhouse gas reduction goals, incentives are only a piece of the puzzle. We're going to need to seriously consider requirements for both new buildings and existing buildings to reach much higher energy efficiency levels, because otherwise you're only really tackling a small number of buildings in the county each year.
Right. And so, moving from the decade past to the decade present,
I was just going to say, I think one of the things that we urge be done in this new program is to come back and revisit it. Don't take 10 years to revisit the program. Let's come back in 3 years at a minimum and see if this new approach does result in more buildings taking up the incentive and getting a broader spectrum of people under the program. So that's one of the strong urgings of the stakeholder work group is let's make sure we're constantly looking at this rather than letting it go a long time. So.
Can I add one last point just to that is, and I totally agree with that, the incentive program isn't designed to get every building in the county to get involved and do that. So that's not going to happen, right? It's just a small piece of the puzzle. But what I would stress on this is it's a program that's in place, that's proven, that has worked, that buildings have actually increased their performance, our buildings, Shane's buildings, and others. And it's been, restructured to encourage others to get involved. And so, to reduce funding to the program and not honestly to increase funding to the program would be a disservice to that. And you already have a program in place that's defined, that people know about, that we can expand and not create from scratch. So my thought is we should encourage and build that program up further. And I know that there's climate action plan and other things happening in the county, which is all good and needs to happen. But that's years from now when you're going to be looking at a report and knowing exactly what we're going to be doing. And we don't have years to the point before to do all of that. Not to say we shouldn't be doing it, we should, but here's a program that exists, that works, that is going to work better based on the working group's recommendations, and to diminish that, I think, would be a sad thing to see.
And I hear that because in 2018, according to the packet, there were 22 applications. So we're already adding more to the queue. And if we know that historically we're only able to do 6 or so, and now we're thinking of changing the funding from $5 million to $3 million, yeah, we will be doing less. And we need to be doing more. Undeniably, I think everybody here understands that we need to be doing more. The last question I have is more of a philosophical statement, quite frankly. And you just touched on it. It's the climate report. It's our consultant report that we allocated a few $100,000 towards this effort of figuring out very targeted. The council was very targeted in requesting a climate report to figure out what tangible steps we can do as quickly as possible to meet the climate change goals that we have here. And I think there are a few instances where there's a disconnect because either the council or the executive are acting ahead of a report which we've spent real money on, trying to help us determine how we use our resources more efficiently. We all share the goal. We need to get there as quickly as possible, but we've set out this process and are taking our time, not years. Hopefully within a few months we'll be getting something back. But we're spending money to figure out how to use our money wisely. And so we need to have that part of the conversation so that we don't just, in this interim time, keep doling out resources for programs that are very worthy, mind you. But there's a goal here, and it's trying to figure out how we all use all these resources wisely. And the questions I ask and the statement I make is out of love. It's because I know we need to reach these climate goals. I just want to make sure that we can provide the biggest bang for our buck and make sure that all these programs are as efficient and targeted as possible. And I'm just a little confused at how we get there right now because we have different processes in place. And I know time is of the essence, but we on the council have set out a process, which is a climate action report. I don't know if anyone has any responses, but that's...
Yeah, I would just say, I understand your point, and we're very cognizant of that as we move forward. One thing that's clearly coming to the front as we go through the work group process is that existing buildings and new buildings, we have to make them more efficient. And to Shane's point about if we can encourage buildings to go out there and push the envelope, that gives us many more examples to show what can be done. And when we get to the point of, we talked about a building energy performance standard, when we say to all buildings, you must improve your performance to some level, now we have these leaders that we can point to and say, they did it, learn from them, follow what they've done. It makes it easier for them to meet the standards that we know inevitably we're going to have to put in place if we're going to reach those climate goals.
Absolutely, so we can have more winning ninja warriors completing the course. That is absolutely the goal. Thank you.
Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First off, thank you to the staff and thank you to the work group. You know, the only way I think that we're going to get the existing buildings to change is incentives. I mean, I don't see how otherwise we're going to have them do that. And even in the idea that they would be saving on their utilities and energy costs, somebody has to convince them that it's worth the investment. And if it's an existing building, if we're not giving incentives, I don't see how we're going to suggest or why they would do it or do it as quickly as we would like. For the whole idea of no cap, I'm leaning there But my concern is how much that's going to cost us a year. And I understand right now we're at 62 or whatever it is over the last six buildings a year, whatever for the new. But you know, at some point we have to know what that's going to cost us over time, and the taxes that we're not getting. The part of the discussion that we had when we were in New York for the bond rating agencies was that there's some discussion about for schools, and in Prince George's County they're doing this, that for the HVAC systems that they're actually getting bonds based on it, on the savings that they would have from the energy, and that they could pay off those bonds from the savings of what they're not spending, or for what the and that certainly seems to be something that private enterprise as well as public should be thinking about doing. There is a savings from that, but I also believe that a 2 to 3 year backlog is not what we want to do. I think that it's to the point that, and I like your idea that it's at permitting, because if somebody doesn't know what, I mean, here you're going to do it, and maybe I'll get my money someday, just doesn't seem to be the most efficient way to do anything. So I think that we have to be concerned about the 2 to year backlog, and I'm assuming that and I don't know how many people sell their buildings in between, but I'm assuming this goes with the building rather than with the owner. Is that correct?
As far as I know, the current program is built that way, where it stays with the property on the account number.
Okay, because, I mean, if they could also sell their building and somebody else would get their credit. I mean, you know, so that's maybe an incentive for somebody else to buy it if you're trying to sell it. But I think that this is, I always like to talk about the puzzle that has to fit together. This is a puzzle that has to fit together. We need all the parts to make certain that they're working. The work group has thought of a lot of good things, and I think we have to make certain that we're doing as many of those good things as we can possibly afford. But I am concerned that we have to figure out exactly what it's going to cost us if there is no cap. I'm leaning that way. But if there is no cap, we have to figure out exactly how much taxes we're not going to be getting. But I applaud everybody what they've done. Thank you.
Councilmember Rear.
Well, what have you been able to identify as far as potential take-up of this revised proposal and what the fiscal impact would be? And how long before the current pipeline is all, expended as far as applications that you've received?
So the current pipeline is an estimated 2 to 3 years. It's a small number of projects, but they're big payout projects based on the current tax incentive. In terms of estimated uptake, I don't think we're going to know until it's on the books and people know about it, and we do some outreach and engagement on that. I will say that since we completed this report back in March of 2019 originally, and then had to get reviews and approvals, the number of people involved in the work group or who heard about the work group that emailed me separately and said, is this in place yet? Can I start talking about this with my clients? People are excited for this. It's brand new. I think that people are going to be able to use this as a direct correlation for making energy efficiency decisions in new buildings, and then encouraging existing buildings to improve.
Okay, but with the existing buildings, the work group recommendation was, what was the cap? Did you recommend a cap on existing buildings?
I don't think we addressed a cap.
I think the idea was that there's a sunset provision, and so what will happen in reality is that it will take time for buildings to be able to comply with or become eligible for the new criteria. And in that period, during those years, while those buildings are in process and working towards their certifications and energy improvements, the old buildings will be working off of the older eligibility. And so it was more an eligible subject to the appropriation, if you will, or the cap that was there, not the cap, to afford those buildings the ability to apply and receive the credit.
I mean, how long is it exactly, like how long will it take for new buildings to apply, do you think?
Years.
Years?
Probably 3 to 4 years, I would think, if you're starting with the permitting, and then you get into construction, and we're not talking, 10,000 square foot buildings. then it's probably going to take a while. One thing to touch based on that Mr. Glass had said earlier about the program and how many people it's covering. That was one thing that the work group thought about extensively and in our meetings. And one way to address that is currently the program requires a LEED certification, and we remove that for energy efficiency, which is going to open up to a huge number of existing buildings. And I have, since working with LEED since 2007, so 12 years now, I'm not sure I've ever worked on an existing building LEED project. There are very few because the certification cost is so high when you get to consultants and all of that. So the goal with Montgomery County, as I know it, is to reduce carbon emissions. You don't need paperwork to reduce carbon emissions. You need less fossil fuel use. So we don't need the paperwork to prove that. We can give you pre and post utility bills. Let's just make action happen, and let's go ahead and make more projects eligible, but prove that they meet the criteria to show their improvement in energy efficiency and reduction in CO2 emissions.
Okay, one quick question for Adriana. So you had said that the executive is now okay with the $5 million cap. What about the $1 million that you are recommending to be reallocated to the climate action plan? I was assuming you were saying that you would reduce, well, you actually had proposed to reduce the cap to $3 million, leaving presumably $2 million difference between the old cap and a new cap, with $1 million being devoted to the action plan. What are you proposing now?
So the county executive is open to keeping the new cap at $5 million annually, and through the fiscal year 21 operating budget process, we will be developing a series of proposals related to climate initiatives. We're still in the drafting stage right now, so I don't have any announcements that I can make, but the climate emergency is definitely one of the county executive's priority outcome areas, and so we'll be looking to make investments in that area.
Okay, but you're not, at this point then, looking to move money from the building incentive fund to another part of the climate action plan?
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we're done here. Thank you all so much for your recommendations. Thank you again to all the stakeholders for putting in all the time, and I really would like to follow up with a number of you gentlemen on some questions without belaboring the hearing today, but the briefing today. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a great night. Thank you to the WSSC group that has joined us. Thank you for accommodating our dynamic schedule. Come on down, please. Yes.
Yeah, no. I want to watch Andrew go to the game. Yeah, my obligation. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to go tomorrow, so sadly, I don't know what I'm really going to do.
Wow.
Are you on?
Yeah, what a dilemma. Such a shame. Yeah.
Ms. Reed, it's very nice to see you. Commissioners, we have the president of the Nats fan club with us, I know, to keep us on track here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again for all the schedule changes. I know it's really inconvenient for you, and sorry about the hour. Mr. Levchenko, do you want to kick us off and frame this annual discussion?
Sure. And it is new for Mr. Reamer, as new to the T&E committee this year, and new for Mr. Glass, new to the council this year. This is a unique spending affordability process for WSSC. Mr. Reamer has dealt with it at the full council, but not at the level of detail that we get at it in the committee. You were on
4 years
that's
on T&E.
right. Oh,
Yeah.
How quickly we forget.
Returning veteran.
Oh, that's right, you're
In
back.
any case, I think we want a abbreviated version,
Right.
given the hour and our guest schedules. Thank you.
I've got a few slides that we could kick through very quickly, and then get to some of the discussion. But before I do that, I know WCC wanted to make a few comments. Ms. Reed, I believe, wanted a few opening comments, and Ms. Foster.
Well, given the hour of the day, I'll be extremely brief. Good afternoon, Chair Hucker. Good afternoon, Councilmember Reamer. Thank you for this opportunity to review our fiscal year 21 spending affordability limits. This budget has been a phenomenal budget because, of course, while we are AAA bond-rated agency, we have AAA challenges. We have challenges in the first A of affordability, second A of aging workforce, third A, our aging infrastructure. And so we've worked very hard to address those three challenges.
A in messaging.
And what?
A in messaging, too, apparently.
A in messaging?
A in well-honed messaging.
Okay, well, I'll take that. Thank you so much. So, we've been working hard to work on our aging workforce by coming up with different models for succession planning, taking our 50 most critical positions and actually establishing a plan for what it might look like when the tenure of those most critical positions are actually ready to retire or otherwise leave WSSC. In terms of affordability, we have certainly added many more options to our portfolio to help customers who have to deal with rate increases. We are sensitive to those issues, and so we have instituted this year a PIPE ER program, which is a low-interest loan program for our customers. We continue to raise money to put in our water fund for customers who have difficulty paying their water bill, and right now we're in the last couple of years, we raised over $800,000. This is the healthiest the fund has been since it actually was instated 25 years ago. And in terms of our aging infrastructure, we're always looking for innovative ways to make sure we address the challenges with our 101-year-old system. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to this presentation and answering your questions. Madam Chair? Vice Chair?
Push the...
Good afternoon. In light of the hour, I don't need to make a lot of comments. Obviously, Commissioner Bayonet and Commissioner Dennis and I are all here to support the staff with the excellent job that they are doing. I did want to take a couple of moments and just to thank Keith for the excellent job that he's done on the analysis. His work is always A+, and we're always happy with it. I think his recommendation is a good one. We're glad that the county executive is endorsing it, and we hope you guys will do the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Real quick, just to provide a quick summary before we get into some of the details. There are 4 limits that are part of this spending control limits package. The maximum average rate increase, which focuses on the volumetric rate that customers pay, not the fixed fees. Those are dealt with separately. Debt service, which is a major element of the operating budget. New debt, which obviously drives future debt service. And then the total water and sewer operating expenses, which encompasses debt service as well as all the other costs within the operating budget. The schedule, real briefly, the Bi-County Work Group, which I'm referencing here, is a staff work group with Montgomery and Prince George's council and executive staffs getting together with WSSC staff. The base case that's mentioned in the packet, that I'll get to in a minute, represents WSSC staff's work. I did want to make clear that the commissioners, while they keep abreast of the issue, do not formally vote on the spending control limits at any time. However, they ultimately obviously have to vote on the budget that will be coming over early next year, and that will have to meet the limits that the 2 councils agree to. We had a public hearing on September 24th. The Prince George's County TIEE Committee met late last week and had more of a Q&A type of briefing. They're going to be meeting again next week. I did want to note that we have heard from the Prince George's staff that they will be recommending a 7% package to their committee. We can't speak to what the committee will do, but at least at the staff level, that's what we've heard from them. And then, of course, our discussion was going to be yesterday. It's today. We will then work with our Prince George's counterparts to come to agreement before we take final action by the end of the month. The spending control limits history is in the packet. I don't want to dwell on it other than it goes back to FY96. And the approved limits are not necessarily indicative of what the final rate will be, or the rate or the other limits in what's approved by both councils in May. And there are several examples on that chart showing actual lower budgets than the limits that were approved in the fall process. It is considered a ceiling, but it does not, it limits WSSC as to what the councils expect to see, but it does not limit the councils to go either below or above. I've got a lot of information on cost trends. I'm not going to dwell on this either, but if council members do have questions during our later discussion, we may reference some of this. I do want to note, overlaying all of this, and one of the reasons why we do see rate increases on that prior slide that are above inflation, one of the main reasons is the dominating source of revenue for WSSC is revenue from its volumetric fees, and that in turn is based on customer demand. And water production, which is reflecting customer demand, is actually flat. It's been flat for the last 20 years. That's due to probably many factors, but one of them certainly is energy conservation and the water conservation element of that. Customers are using less water per capita. In fact, during this 20-year period, we've had a growth of about 24% in WSSC's population served, but the actual water usage is actually down a little bit. It's been up and down over the years, but it's basically flat over the 24 years, maybe even down somewhat. So that is indicative of a very positive result in terms of water conservation. On the financial side, though, that means WSSC is collecting significantly less revenue than it otherwise would. And under its old rate structure, we're now under a new rate structure, but under its old rate structure, that was magnified because customers paid at the highest rate where they fell in their average daily consumption. So it was magnified under that. So this creates an unusual or unique fiscal pressure that, for the most part, Montgomery County has not had to deal with. If you look at the equivalent side on our end, maybe looking at property taxes, it's unusual for our assessable base to decline in a given year. And actually our property taxes are only about a third of our revenue sources. 87% of WSSC's revenue is coming from volumetric rates, and those are not delivering increases in years. They're actually showing a decline in revenue, and so that has to be made up in rates. I did mention that we're under a new rate structure. I've just put it up here real briefly. Unlike the old rate structure, customers pay through the tiers for their usage. So the first 80.9999 gallons is at one rate. The next tier of gallons is at the second rate, and so forth. So it eliminates some of that volatility of customers moving between tiers that can also cause revenue fluctuations for WSSC. Now, the spending control limits themselves. The base case that I had mentioned that WSSC staff came up with is on this slide. It assumes an 8% rate increase for the upcoming fiscal year. It's actually a multi-year presentation, which is in the packet. We obviously have to focus on the first year, but we look at those out years as well. And there are several years of that 8% assumed before it declines again. And there's lots of inputs and assumptions in that. I'll try to touch on a few of those that I think are important to the committee, but there's a lot of data in the packet that we can refer to if necessary. The 8% rate increase also then flows into these other limits in terms of new debt. The new debt and debt service under this scenario is consistent with WSSC's recently transmitted capital improvements program that the council will be taking up early next year. So that's one major assumption in this. And then total water and sewer operating expenses, there's a number of assumptions with regard to that, which I'll touch on very briefly. I mentioned the debt service and the fact that that's assumed in the CIP. There's also an assumption of PAYGO, and this is really serving two purposes. Just like with the county's PAYGO, a portion of it is intended to offset debt service and try to keep debt service at a manageable level. Historically, under the spending control limits process, we've tried to keep WSSC's debt service at or below 40% of their budget. Now that sounds quite high, which it is. It's much higher than the county's debt service levels, but it's more expected in an organization, a utility like WSSC, where much of their activity is industrial and involved in very capital intensive. But the PAYGO is also intended to address some urgent issues they have with regard to infiltration and infill issues with regard to its Piscataway wastewater treatment plant. And I've noted that in the packet. They had significant capacity issues at the plant over the past year in 2018 and part of 2019. The committee may recall that we had historically high levels of rain during that time. And as pipes can leak out, they can also leak in. So a lot of stormwater can get into those pipes, and it created significant capacity issues at the plant. And WSSC feels that in addition to pipe replacement, there's also a significant amount of maintenance work that needs to be accelerated in that area, and that's assumed in the this base case scenario in their PAYGO assumption. So that's also a significant assumption this year. Some of these other issues here are more common that we've seen from year to year. Employee compensation, which the two councils have agreed to make comparable to their office employee compensation, and that's something we look at each spring based on the contracts that are up and what the assumptions are coming over from the executives each year. We also assume inflationary increases in current programs. There's a 2% assumption built into this base case, which is similar to past years. We have regional disposal costs, which are a formula charge from DC Water based on flows. This is the increase they're assuming in FY21 for that. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, funds available. This gets at the volumetric rate issue and also use of fund balance. Those numbers are down a bit. WSSC had to write off some revenue loss last year, and that has to be made up in rates. I talked about that earlier. And then within the base case, WSSC has also recommended some additional funding for potential additional and reinstated programs. These are programs that WSSC may have done at one time, or they do now, but look to accelerate or increase. Generally, they're best practices that they would do if resources are available. And these are some issues we have dealt with later in the budget process and move forward when the two councils have agreed. It's still a little early this year. We don't have a budget even before us yet. But in WSSC's base case, they have assumed some allowance for that. And this chart basically puts it all together in how you build to that 8% rate increase, progressively up from the changes in funds available, debt service, PAYGO, and so forth, all the way down. So now we get to the options. And you heard earlier the executive's recommendation and council staff's recommendation was for a 7% rate increase assumption. And what that means would be, and I note here on the slide in front of you, each 1% rate increase adds about $6.5 million in revenue to WSSC's budget. So a 7% rate increase would mean about a $6.5 million assumed reduction, if you will, in the budget. That would be most of what you saw earlier in those additional and reinstated programs. So there'd be a little bit left over for that, but for the most part, they would have to find savings within their budget or other assumptions that maybe were higher in order to find the resources to do some of that additional work. But staff will note that historically, with the spending control limits, the councils, both councils, I would say, have generally, while recognizing that we are in a above inflationary increased period, we are still trying to encourage WSSC to work within its base, especially to find dollars for additional work that it feels it needs to do. The 7% is about where that gets you, and that's where the executive was, and that's where council staff is today. I think, yeah, and this chart actually shows how the new numbers would look, and these are staff's numbers. We would work with WSSC to finalize a 7% model, so these numbers might wiggle a little bit, but they're pretty close. And as you can see, I also included the residential customer impact at several different daily consumption levels to show. The increases are actually a little bit lower than the rate increase, and that's because you have fixed fees that are not assumed to change, that are built into the bill. So the numbers are a little bit lower percentage-wise for those bill increases. So that's all staff has in terms of background. We have lots of folks at the table here that can answer questions for WSSC, and staff's also happy to elaborate further on staff's recommendation.
Thank you. Any comments from the panelists? I didn't see any lights. So. Did Mr. Levchenko say it all correctly? Wonderful. Okay. Any comments from my colleagues? Mr. Reamer.
Okay. Well, I wish we didn't have to approve a rate increase, but the reality is, with many factors, including improving efficiency, it's just something we're continuing to have to confront. So I think I'll concur with the council staff's recommendation. Wanted to congratulate you on hiring Al Rashdi. I don't know if I feel like you are the place where everyone goes. So that's good. That's good for WSSC. It's good for the county. A lot of our best people are with you, and so it gives us a lot of confidence, and appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilmember Reamer. We really appreciate having those great resources and, the addition of the talent and skills that they bring to our team. And WSSC is a place where people can thrive, and we really have innovation built into our DNA. And we're hoping that one day we won't have to bring you any rate increases, because our innovations will create another stream of revenue that will offset some of the debt and rate increases. And we can't do that without really good people.
This is true. I know, Dr. Foster, that's a big part of your portfolio, I think, right? The innovation component. And an issue I just wanted to keep before us. We had a huge presentation today about the regional housing goals and how the region must create 320,000 units of housing in the next 12 years, and how the county is a big piece of that. We've got to probably double our housing production in the county. I understand the conversations are continuing about Littonsville, so I hope that you'll bring your innovative thinking to finding solutions there, because it's something that the council really put a lot of effort in to envision a big, bold solution right on the purple line. And, we got out there on a limb, and we need everybody to try to help us figure out how to bring it home. So just wanted to ask, is there any update on that? Is that conversation? I had heard that you were recently involved in some meetings about it. May not have been you directly, Ms. Reed, but I don't know.
No, it hasn't been me directly, Councilmember Reamer, but we are still open to options that the county, HOC, and its developer will bring forward for us to consider. As you know, the current option that's on the table was not as viable as we had all hoped it would be. So we're looking forward to hearing other options and alternatives and considering those.
Hopefully, we'll get to a solution. Thank you.
Councilmember Glass.
Thank you. So this being my first time going through the spending limit conversation, in the packet, I see the historical rate increases and limits, and clearly see that there was a period of time when there was much more constraint, and then that constraint burst open. And so I presume that the levels in the early, starting in 2009, essentially, and going for a few years thereafter, were a direct result of what I'll say was the drought, budgetary drought in the years prior. And so what I like about now, if there's anything to like about any rate increases, is the moderate tone of them. Clearly, it's not nothing like in some years, but it's not 9.9% that were in 2011 or 12 or so forth. So I think that's good. The one question I will ask you, though, in your budgetary forecast, are there any new marketing plans that you might be devising?
No.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Okay, well, you know, after DC rebranded itself, I thought it was a positive. You know, I thought it was helped communicate a new kind of thinking. So I don't know. I feel like some people jumped all over you for wanting to get, you know, to kind of rethink how the public perceives you. But I think how the public perceives you is really important. And, you know, the role that you play as a service provider is something that people need to, you know, understand clearly. And maybe it needs to be refreshed. Fresh water is something we all believe in. So, you know, I think a little politics was played at your expense on that one, frankly. But, you know, I trust you'll figure out how to make it work, maybe at a pace that everyone can absorb. But I did want to ask, what's the latest on the meters? I know we had some discussion about that.
Are we talking about the advanced metering infrastructure?
Yeah, there was a big discussion, I think, recently, and it's just any quick update you could provide.
I'm going to defer to our Deputy General Manager of Operations, Jay Price, to come and give us update on that.
Does not need to be lengthy,
Right.
just a quick, yeah.
RFP is actually on the street right now, so that's all I can say about it.
The RFP for the whole program.
That's correct. Looking at the different options and different prices coming back.
And you did not decide not to allow people to opt out?
We have not made that decision yet.
Okay, fine. I don't think that's a good idea, personally. Just wanted to say that. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Since we've engaged in the conversation about media and outreach and rebranding, I will share I will elaborate a little more on my thought. And the thought is public utilities show their value and demonstrate their worth when they do their work well and keep their budgets constrained. That is how public utilities prove themselves. Rebranding efforts might be fine and good, but that's all they are. They're just rebranding, and it's just paint and just names. And it means nothing unless the work of that monopoly is good. And I'm not using that in a bad way. WSSC is a monopoly. It's a public monopoly because we can't get our water from anyone else. It's just a technical definition. And so keep doing your work. Keep doing it in the budget guidelines that we're providing. And thank you.
That is our number one goal. We, in 101 years of our existence, have never had a single water quality violation, and that is that's the quality that we always aim for. WSSC may be a monopoly, but that is not the attitude that I want our employees to embrace. I want them to treat our customers as if our customers have a choice. Meaning that if they had a choice and they weren't happy with us, they would walk away. And we don't want our customers to lose confidence in us, and they at least, feel like they're heard and valued. And actually, we've been WSSC Water since 2002 in our email address and in our website address. And this effort was to bring it full circle. That's one thing that it was to do. The other thing is that as we sell the innovations that we come up with, that we get patented, we're not operating just in this regional space. We're operating in the national and international space. So that was also a consideration that we had to keep in mind when we were getting the feedback that we did with our focus groups that told us how they viewed us as their local utility.
Thank you. Can you elaborate a little bit, Ms. Foster, on the timeline for any kind of savings around the innovation you described, or Ms. Reed?
Okay. Well, the timeline, I don't know if we've sketched it all out, because we have a business development manager who is, testing the market on some of those proposed ideas. The other thing is that we're looking to see if those ideas are patentable. Not sure exactly when all that return on investment, because it's a really new program. And we actually set up a department that's focusing on innovation because we embrace that as one of our core values. So I would like to come back with you as we continue to march down the road and get some more specific details on that. What I can tell you is that sort of in the frame of innovation, it's not just about tools and technology, but it's also about processes. And one process that we have instituted is strategic sourcing. And what that does for us is it gets us to look at the landscape on all different kinds of things, including chemicals and vehicles, to see how we can bring down our costs on that. And the program has been in place for quite some time. Keith probably knows better than me how many years the strategic sourcing program. 2013 is when it was first instituted, and in the last how many years, Patty, have we had the millions of?
I think. Excuse me. For the record, Patty Callahan, CFO. I think when you go back and look at cost avoidance and cost reduction, it's about $92 million overall. Just getting the teams together and looking at different ways of buying and sourcing and using chemical use and different chemicals. So it's quite impressive.
Right, and we've discussed some of that. I appreciate all that, and I certainly appreciate the savings this year on the heat, light, and power. That's terrific. I always have this feeling in this hearing at this time, like we don't give this analysis, we sort of give it short shrift, it feels like. Maybe it doesn't feel like that to you, but to me it always feels like we're sort of rushed into this, and we have a budget deadline and a deadline to get our recommendation to Prince George's and other things, and I really would like to find some time to hear, maybe in a smaller group, and not at 5:30 at night when we have other events to get to tonight, but about a lot of the possibilities in this area, because I got to say, I don't want to belabor the point. We've talked about it many times publicly and privately. I'm not excited about the 7% increase, and I'm not excited about the sort of routine significant increases that we've become accustomed to approving. And I don't love having the choices before us be 7% or 8%. I wish we had a none of the above, because I think our constituents and your ratepayers, they stop me on the street, stop me in the grocery store all the time to complain about their water bills, not the quality and not the customer service and not many other things, but just the cost. And I know how you've measured up in the benchmarking study, and we've discussed this many times, but in terms of just the pain people are feeling when they're dealing with other cost drivers that are growing far above the rate of inflation, like childcare, like college educations, like their rent, they're having a really hard time paying their water bills, which is not an option for them. So, I really would welcome any opportunity to work with you to drive some of those costs down. I know most of your costs are fixed and there's a lot of decisions outside of your control, but when our constituents and your ratepayers see 7% again, explaining why that is and all these factors outside your control isn't a satisfying answer to them at all. So I hope we can bore down on some of the restructuring you might need to do or innovative efforts that you have in mind, because it always feels like they get sort of short shrift in this discussion. Will you be, I don't know if you have any comment on that. You don't have to.
None, but we would be happy to have a more detailed conversation and outline where we think we're going.
Okay, yeah, maybe not even happy, but sure, we can have it. What is your current posture on whether you will again seek state authority to have a variable rate structure by customer class?
No time in the foreseeable future, because we have to let the current rate structure settle in. To change it every year is quite unsettling. We just built a new billing system that had to incorporate this. So at least get through this fiscal year before we would consider doing that.
Sure. I mean, and to be clear, I'm not recommending changing your rate structure, which obviously took years now to get through that whole tortuous process and get approved, but just seeking the authority from our 24 delegates and our 8 senators and our colleagues in Prince George's to give you the authority to do what PEPCO does and do what every electric utility does and have a different rate structure for commercial customers and residential customers so that single moms with 3 kids aren't paying the same rate as a limousine washing service, to me is just the fair and progressive and right thing to do. And regardless of the results in previous legislative sessions, I think that's something we ought to embrace, and I'll do my best to get the council and the county exec and others, my colleagues, my former colleagues in the state legislature behind that, because I really think we need to move in that direction, and there's no reason you shouldn't have that authority. And I hope you'll join me in that, because I don't think it's going to move without your support.
Well, it's certainly something that we'll have a conversation about. I understand it is just enabling legislation.
Right.
And
Enactment would be over a year away anyway. Right.
and we will get back to you and work with you on it.
Okay. So with that, do we have a motion for the 7, I guess? Second. Keith? Without objection? We're good?
Yeah, just to note, as I mentioned, the numbers will wiggle a little bit when I get the final 7% model from WSSC, but you'll see numbers very similar to what you see on your screen right now.
Very similar or less, as you reminded us, it's a ceiling. And
in terms of next year. I'm talking about when we go to the council. The next step in the process will be to reach out to the Prince George's Council and staff and try to come to agreement. Like I said, I think we're pretty close, although we don't know exactly where the TIEE committee is, since they haven't publicly talked about rates. But so we're looking at by the end of the month we'll finalize resolutions at both councils.
Okay. Thank you all so much for bearing with our crazy schedule.